We are now live.
Okay.
Perfect.
Hello to everyone.
Yeah. Hi. I'm so happy to have Daniel Mietchen with us, and I've asked him to talk to us today a bit about Wikidata medicine and research. So Daniel, let's begin with just a brief maybe recap or some kind of I don't know, description of what type of Wikidata projects around medicine already are in existence and are happening these days.
Okay. Well, you can slice medicine in different ways. So first you have like traditional medical concepts that have Wikipedia articles in Wikidata. So all the major medical fields, they have Wikidata entries. Then all the major diseases, the major drugs, the companies that produce the drugs, and so on. All these topics have entries on Wikidata. Then there are certain things that you won't easily find in Wikipedia. So that is specific genes, proteins, or let's say non-major drugs, and also the literature about all these topics. And so that's quite an area of, let's say, important things that are relevant to medicine. Another aspect is, of course, those medical articles. They are written by people, some of which may have Wikipedia articles, but many don't. And Wikidata is covering, well, some more of them. And yeah, then there's all these diagnostic techniques and so on. So yeah, it's a growing ecosystem. Let's put it that way. And that's just the content. Then the content comes in through multiple ways, some of which is actually or was syncing with Wikipedia's. Others come in through syncing with external databases. Yet others come in through some mediation between those external sources and Wikidata, through things like mix and match and Wikidata games, which are ways by which users can decide as to whether a given concept in Wikidata actually corresponds to a concept outside. And
can you give an example, Daniel, of a few of these external databases that have been incorporated to Wikidata?
Yeah, I actually shared an Etherpad with you, and in that it's currently in line 4, we have a template, medical properties. So that is not exhaustive, but just click on that, you get lists like symptoms, has cause, medical examinations, medical treatment.
Let me just find this Etherpad.
Yeah, okay.
I don't. Where did you send it to?
I sent it to our email thread that we have.
Found it. Let's see. Oh gosh. So where would I find this one? It would be under what?
Line 4.
Line 4. Okay. Got it.
Yeah. So depending on
medical properties.
Yeah, medical properties, and then many of those are actually identifiers in external databases like UniProt, Kimball, Medline Plus, ChemSpider, Disease Ontology, PubMed ID, and so on. And then there are other things that pertain to the function, like for instance, neurological function is a property P970 on Wikidata. There are properties for side effects, for like the health specialty that is actually studying a certain medical topic, things like that, or the onset of schizophrenia, for instance.
Okay.
Yeah, and so we have the content, we have the properties that link the different concepts, and then we have communities that deal with both, basically. And the canonical go-to project for medical stuff is Wiki Project Medicine. which has a branch on Wikidata, as it has on many other Wikimedia projects. And what Wiki Project Medicine does is, well, help structure the information on Wikidata. So it looks at the properties that exist and how they're used. It looks at properties that might be missing and suggests how those gaps might be addressed. For all of this, they work on data models. So what kind of properties should we have on items that are a disease? Are diseases actually instances or subclasses of disease, of the generic property disease, and things like that? There's some debate around how to model this. Then they will keep lists of items, like, for instance, if you have a list from the World Health Organization of the top 100, let's say, pathogens or something like this, then we will try to make the list as complete as possible on Wikidata. This involves running queries, and so some structured way of asking questions, and yeah, keeping track of the literature around all these topics, and interacting with wiki projects that have related scopes. So I put in also in the Etherpad a link to the category Science Wiki projects. And if you click on that, you see there is biology wiki projects, there is wiki project chemistry, wiki project universities, wiki project bioinformatics, and things like that. And all of these overlap to some extent with what Wiki Project Medicine is doing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, we can screen share if you want, so you can actually show specific things if you want.
Yeah, we could do that. Yeah, let me try. I don't normally use Hangouts, so I know I have screen shared before, but I don't find the button right now. Screen share, here we go.
Yeah, the green thingy on the left.
Yeah. You are screen sharing. Okay, so you see yourself now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so in the Etherpad, we'll probably share it in the notes to the video later on.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so just Wiki Project Medicine that I just mentioned. So it has a homepage. It has certain resources, certain participants, including 2 bots. Yeah, that's a specialty of Wikidata, that there are lots of bots. Then the properties that I mentioned, some are here in more or less a list fashion. A more compact view is medical properties that I mentioned before. There are similar such templates. So for instance, for anatomy and other things more specific. So that these are the properties that the Wiki project cares about. Then on data models, this is not very well documented here, but we have quite elaborate data models for things like diseases and genes and proteins. Rather nascent data models for clinical trials and vaccines. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to have a decent way of representing those concepts in Wikidata. Mm-hmm. Then here we have, yeah, you want to say something?
I just wanted to ask, would you say that most of the work is still done manually, or is it generated by bots and data imports and stuff like that?
That's actually not easy to answer, because there are different kinds of work. So the data modeling, I'm not aware of any bot being participant in that directly. That is entirely humans at the moment. Although we do look at what others have done in terms of providing ontologies or other controlled vocabularies in this space. On the other hand, in terms of importing, once a data model exists and we have identified suitable data sources, almost all of the work is being done by bots. And of course, they need to be written and run usually by humans. So it's a mixed thing.
Okay. Any notable projects? I mean, I've heard of GeneWiki and
Yeah.
sorry?
I didn't fully understand your first word. Any what projects?
Notable projects around our topics?
Yeah, of course. The GeneWiki is a key thing to mention here. So if you go back to the home page of Wiki Project Medicine, under participants, you see the protein box bot, which is like one of the main bots used by the GeneWiki project. So they also have a page, Wiki Project GeneWiki, and so that is basically a research group at the Scripps Institute in California. And what they do is really sync at scale information about genes, proteins, diseases, and drugs between Wikidata and external databases. And yeah, they have a range of bot accounts, as you can see here, that do slightly different but quite related things around the concepts I just mentioned. So here, for instance, you see the properties, it doesn't enlarge, the properties that one of the bots is caring for in terms of things that are relevant to proteins. Okay. Let me go quickly finish the project medicine thing. So yeah, queries. We will probably get back to them a number of times. So here is a simple one, map of hospitals. So that if you click on the query is expressed in Sparkle, which is a special query language. This actually isn't shown as a map. So.
Yeah, the students actually learn Sparkle and
well,
Sparkle. So
yeah, so here you have a map of hospitals. Of course, this map is incomplete, but at least you get a rough idea, and you can zoom in on any of that. And if you want to be more specific, then you would have to start discussing data models for hospitals, like, and then again, you can build on what others have done in this space. There are classifications by Médecins Sans Frontières and World Health Organization and so on that you can look at and then see to what extent you can use them. Then, yeah, many more queries that, and those queries, they serve a variety of functions. First, they help us identify like what kind of properties are actually used on items about hospitals, so that informs discussions around the data model. Queries may serve to help with quality assurance, like if, for instance, a cinema is classified as a hospital, maybe we don't want this, or maybe it is the same building that houses both a cinema and a hospital, and we have to clarify that, or it was a hospital before and now it's a cinema, or the other way around. So all these things exist. And the queries, they help you find those edge cases and then make decisions on how to model them. And finally, the main reason why we do those queries is actually to discover knowledge, to find out about things that are not easily discoverable using other means. The next tab is literature. That is, well, not very well documented, but we now have a vast array of literature in Wikidata. We'll probably get back to that later on. And the project also deals with certain lists that could be generated via Wikidata queries, or that are still maintained more or less manually on Wikipedia, and we're trying to build Wikidata equivalents. So yeah, that's the kind of projects that Wiki Project Medicine is engaging.
Any gaps that you see here? I mean, anything that you think is missing in terms of what Wiki Project Medicine is doing right now in Wikidata?
Well, if you just judge by those generic 6 tabs that you can see here, I think it's more or less complete. But the problem is, if you dig deeper into any of them, then the problems become apparent quite quickly. So one problem that is persistent throughout the Wikiverse is documentation. So the literature subpage was a good example of that. Some more substantial problems are actually the data models. So we don't have good data models for vaccines, for clinical trials, for hospitals, and many other things that are relevant to medicine. Somewhat developed is the items and queries, usually patchy. So in some areas, like proteins and diseases and genes, we have really detailed sets of queries that also will show you interesting things. We can go back to that later on. In terms of the properties, we're making decent progress. So we have lots of ways to describe things that are relevant to medicine. But for instance, we don't often make a good distinction between diseases that are human diseases and diseases that are diseases of other organisms as well. There is much less coverage of veterinary medicine or of, let's say, plant-based information that's relevant to medicine than of the more classical medical fields. Then many of the properties have labels only in English and a few other languages. So if you, for instance, look at the template that you see here in Hebrew, I guess that a number of them will just not have Hebrew labels. And that's the case for many items as well. So if you really want to make use of the information in multiple languages, then you will easily find gaps there as well. And then, of course, things like the literature, they're only indexed partly. So right now, about half of PubMed is indexed in Wikidata, which is a good, sizable number. It's 13 million papers, but still it's only half of PubMed, and PubMed is only part of the medical literature, and that's only part of the literature overall. And what I mean by index in Wikidata is just that Wikidata has an item about this particular paper. Then the task is to how we can link that item about the paper to the items about the topics that the paper is about, or to the items of the authors of the paper, and then how to link the authors to the institutions where they work or to their fields of work in order to allow new ways of discovery. And all of that is happening. It's happening at scale, but it is still happening at a scale that makes the corpus vastly incomplete and underconnected. So there's lots of room for getting engaged.
So basically, if someone wants to contribute in that area, that would be manual work, or do we have a Wikidata game for it, or I don't know, any other method of doing it quicker?
Well, it really depends on the task. Like for identifying properties that are missing, we have no tools. It's even not so easy to get an overview of the properties that already exist. Like this template only gives you some of those things that are relevant to medicine. And for things where the data model is clear, where the data sources are identified, we might even have semi-automated or automated ways of importing. So that's basically what the GeneWiki project has perfected. So
I was talking about your example of PubMed.
Okay.
So when we have an article that has a Q number, but is not connected, say, to the author or to the topic.
Okay. Yeah, so we have some tools that now it actually is problematic that I'm not on my normal browser. Hangouts don't work in Firefox. I normally work in Firefox, and here in Google, I'm not logged in on Wikimedia and so on, so I can't really show you those things. But we have some tools like Fatamir that I'll just paste in here somewhere. We can sort it out later. that helps to create items about papers, and we have similar tools. One of them is Resolve Authors. Let me see whether I can find that. Here. So here you put in like Jane Smith or something like this, which will list you all the papers where an author appears under the name Jane Smith. And that is just the string. And then it groups them in several ways, taking into account the topics of the paper. So here, neural development and also co-authors. And in the end, it suggests to you people who are known to Wikidata by that name or alias. And of course, well, a cyclist is unlikely to be the author of such papers, but you've got to check. And very often, this person is still missing in Wikidata. So you can create a new item. Also, you can check whether there are any Jane Smiths in ORCID. Yes, there are. So you can have fun matching those who have an ORCID to those who are in Wikidata, to those who are actually the authors of the paper. But yes, we have some tools that facilitate all that. So you don't have to do it entirely by hand. You can use tools like this, but there's still a lot of manual work involved. On the other hand, for people who do have an ORCID, we have some more automated tools. So for instance, there is a bot that watches items being created about papers. And then if the paper has an author for which ORCID has a record, then the link between the paper and the author can be done automatically. And so this ecosystem is evolving, and automation is progressing where it can, but things like author disambiguation still require lots of human input. And for Jane Smith is a relatively simple example. There are other examples like Wang Zhang or Li Li or so, where you basically have thousands of papers with the same string, and then these have to be mapped to hundreds of authors. And so that's where the current manual approaches, they simply fail, which means we would have to talk to authoritative bodies like the Chinese Academy of Sciences or so, because they keep internal records of who has published what. I guess there is something similar in Israel. And then we can try to distinguish between the different people who share the same name. Yeah, so here the query for Lili actually takes a lot of time, and some of them will time out. There are just too many hits. But for most names, it works reasonably well. And so you can actually go through the suggestions by the tool and then identify those papers that actually are written by that person that you want to map.
Really, basically, the ones that you think are relevant to the actual Jane Smith you're talking about, and then what?
Well, maybe let's not take Jane Smith, but let's take Céline Auxerre here as an example. Well, prototype, the demonstration effects. Now the tool doesn't load. Maybe it's because it's so busy with the Chinese names. Yeah, maybe you can get back to that later, or I just paste it into the Etherpad for now.
Okay.
And we can then see whether we, whether it will resolve at some point, or you can run it on your computer. Maybe it works there. It might also be a JavaScript thing here for me. Yeah, it would actually be nice to demonstrate that workflow at some point. But let's stick to the overflow right now, because the tool, it doesn't do. And I'm not logged in here anyway, so I can't fully show the workflow. Yeah, so I'll just close that window.
Okay.
We close a few more tabs so that we get the overview. Yeah, so that was basically the things that are relevant to your first question about important projects that already happen around Wikidata and medicine.
Mm-hmm. Apropos PubMed, what needs to happen so all the other half is on Wikidata?
Well, first we need to discuss as to whether we actually want to have all of it. Second, the tools have to be run to actually do the job. For a subset, I've actually tried to set up a Wikidata item for all papers that are indexed in PubMed Central, which is roughly a subset of PubMed. And this hasn't worked for some items. So PubMed Central has on the order of 4.5 to 5 million papers. Mm-hmm. And a bit less than 4 million are in Wikidata. And so there's between 500,000 and 1 million for which the item creation didn't work for various reasons. So we have to improve the tools. Yeah, and then people keep publishing new stuff. So we have to build tools that actually screen places like PubMed and PubMed Central for new publications.
Sorry about
what's that? Your phone? Okay, I can't hear at the moment.
Sorry about that. I just had to to shut my phone up.
Yeah. Okay. So we have to adapt the tools and watch out for new publications. And for PubMed Central, this is relatively straightforward because the metadata is more or less in a consistent format, largely because PubMed Central is younger. PubMed is older and has seen some shifts in how they represent the metadata. So tools that understand the metadata for some subset of PubMed, they might not understand it for another subset. And yeah, also the range of journals is broader in PubMed. It also, for instance, includes some non-English language journals. And yeah, so things are just a bit more complex. And that's why I don't think we're going to get to 100% anyone soon. But yeah, growing more is certainly planned. And the way this literature corpus is growing is actually driven by use cases. So people dive into specific areas, let's say, of medicine, and then they try to find the literature that is relevant to that, and then they annotate it. So we have done this for a few topics. So I gave a few examples in lines 28 to 30 in the Etherpad. Let me see how these work. So you were asking about tools. So what you see here is another tool called Collier. So what Collier does is it basically exposes the content in Wikidata on a number of things. So you see here could be an author, a work, an organization, a venue, or like a journal, a conference series, a publisher, and so on. Could also be a topic. So here I've chosen the topic view, and so you see here all the papers that have been tagged as being about the Zika virus. You see they have only been tagged with Zika virus. So for instance, this one could be tagged with Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, but this tagging hasn't happened. And so tagging things with one subject is only a starting point. Then you can do some basic statistics, like how has the number of publications about the topic evolved over time. You see, well, there was a big spike in 2016 for the Zika virus. Mm-hmm. You see topics that co-occur with the Zika virus. So that's the Zika virus infection, for instance. It's congenital Zika virus infection. And it's also important to kind of keep an eye on the distinction between those things. Mm-hmm. Then the Zika virus epidemic, you also see chikungunya virus popping up and so on. You see the same data represented as a graph here. That's a quite busy graph, lots of JavaScript that sometimes make it a bit difficult to handle that graph, especially if you're talking right now. But in principle, you can zoom in on any of those things. You see here, influenza virus is zooming by the 2016 Summer Olympics, and all of these concepts, they're related to the Zika virus in some way, and there are some papers for which both topics have been tagged as being relevant to that paper in Wikidata. You can also show like who are the authors of papers about the Zika virus. So this helps you identify certain experts. For instance, imagine you have written a Wikipedia article on the topic, and then you want to get some expert feedback. So these are some people you might consider writing an email to and asking them for feedback on what you've written. So this graph about the authors comes about by taking into account what papers they have written that have been tagged with Zika virus, or citations between, well, to and from those papers. And so, yeah, you see some score that we're using to build that graph. You can also get an idea about journals that are publishing works on a topic. So, for instance, if you have just written a paper or you plan to write a paper, you think about, well, where might I send it?
Yeah.
Where to send it. And then there is also a citation graph. So what are the most cited works on the Zika virus? This data, all of that data is very incomplete, but at least those things that are on top here, they're usually relevant. They might not be the most relevant. There might be something that is more relevant and not indexed in Wikidata yet. Yeah, you see it's a Zika virus outbreak on Yap Island. It is really on the topic. And likewise, you get the most cited authors, which is similar to the graph you had seen before. And so that's one way to look at the data that Wikidata has about a particular topic. And from there, you can browse to any other related topic. So for instance, go to the Zika virus transmission or microcephaly, Zika virus transmission or microcephaly entries in Collier. Oh, microcephaly, you see, aha, okay. Here, this was some automatic forward. So we have a way to actually model diseases as such, and we expose some information of that, which right now is very rudimentary, but if we don't regard it as a disease, but just as a topic, then the information is a bit richer. And yeah, you see the same data that we just had seen for the Zika virus, you now see it for microcephaly. In this way, you can walk your way, and these are live queries, so this query is still running. You can walk your way through the literature, and then you can also click on any of those papers at any point, which will have a Wikidata entry. So here, for instance, the authors haven't been mapped. Some topics have been mapped. Citations have not been mapped. So yeah, there's lots of things. Citations per year are not mapped. And there are no statements that are actually supported by this paper. So the main reason why we do import all the literature is we want statements in Wikidata to be supported by references. And scholarly articles are one of the main kinds of references that are used for this purpose. But entering all the metadata about a scholarly article is a bit tedious if you want to just reference a particular fact. And that's why we're focusing on mass importing items or mass curating items about papers so that you just refer to the item in your reference and don't have to deal with all the associated metadata, like what its DOI is, what its author was, and so on. You just refer to the item and then all the information is there. But once you have that, if there is a paper for which a statement has been supported with the paper, let's just go to another example, then this would show up in those queries. So here, for another paper, you see this paper supports the statement that on the item of this protein domain, there's a property biological process, and the value has extrinsic apoptotic signaling pathway. So this particular protein domain is apparently involved in that signaling pathway according to that particular paper. And so you have different ways of browsing the literature or the knowledge in the area, and then you can use those Sparkle queries to filter by whatever your interests are. And apart from the Zika virus, there are two more, let's say, sample corpora that are being developed, so for which the literature is reasonably complete. So that is maternal mortality and veteran suicide. So again, you see the same statistics. The really interesting is actually the co-occurring topics. We used to have a co-author network as well, but that's getting too complex now that the data is more complete, and so it often times out. Yeah, and let me also briefly show the veteran suicide. So you see here there's quite some.
So you've mentioned completeness of data. How do you track, if you can, even the completeness of the work being done on Wikidata?
We basically have no easy way of doing this. If we have identifiers like PubMed identifiers, then it's simple. You just count how many PubMed IDs are there in PubMed and how many PubMed IDs are in Wikidata, and then you get the number of roughly 50% right now. But if it's something like veteran suicide, you first have to have an idea of how many papers there are actually about this. So you would, for instance, start with let's say a PubMed search, and then you see how many papers pop up there. And then you might look around for potential synonyms of the topic. You include those in your search, and then you do the same on Wikidata and see what pops up, and then you get a rough idea. But as you can see from my description, that is a very error-prone process. So the completeness can only be assessed on a level of very incomplete to rather complete to something in the middle. And we basically have nothing that is fully complete.
Mm-hmm.
Although, well, yes, the most complete data sets are probably those that are corrected by the GeneWiki team. So they have a highly complete set of human genes and rat genes and human proteins and so on, to the level that they're now discussing how to model gene variants and sequence variants. And
can you repeat the last sentence? What are they discussing now?
Variants, so genetic variation, sequence variants.
Mm-hmm.
And so in principle, according to the standard human genome sequence, the genes that are identified there, they're all in Wikidata. But of course, your genes and my genes, they differ from that standard human genome sequence. And there are databases that collect information about such variation. Now we're in the process of discussing how such information about variation could be incorporated into Wikidata.
Mm-hmm. And where do we stand on drugs?
Yeah, well, they're also in. Let me see. Just give me one that's. Let's see. Okay, maybe I go directly for aspirin.
Yeah, something simple.
Here again, we have different ways of representing it in Collier. Here it's treated as a chemical. So you get the information like which external databases know something about aspirin, or what related compounds exist, what are its physical and physical chemical properties. then what has recently been published on the topic, and how did those publications change by year. There is a spike in here, which to me looks like an artifact of the import probably, which may mean that for the year 2001, we're nearly complete, or let's say more complete in terms of covering the aspirin literature. And in all the other years, we're just very incomplete. On the other hand, you can change the Collier view from chemical to topic, and then you get the view of the literature that is on aspirin. For some reason, carbon pops up here. That's probably not intended. We should take a look at that. Maybe there's some problem in the data model. Maybe aspirin is classified as a subset of carbon or something like this. It, of course, includes carbon, but I wouldn't classify it as a subset of it. Yeah, and then you get all this overview of that. And yeah, sometimes there are problems, and those need to be fixed. So that's a simple way of getting an overview on any given topic. So many drugs, all the FDA-approved drugs are in Wikidata at a similar level of detail to what you've just seen for aspirin. And but there are like many millions of drugs in PubChem and ChemSpider, and yeah, most of them are not in Wikidata. And the import or the creation of new items for those missing ones is also basically driven by topic. So if you're working in a particular area and you're trying, let's say, the Zika virus or so, and you're trying to make that particular area more complete, then you will watch out for drugs that are relevant in that area and then create those items. And yeah, then people working in another area, they will watch out for other drugs and then create those items, so that it grows organically in many directions. And initiatives like the GeneWiki, they help keep the data reasonably up to date and consistent across the corpus.
You've mentioned before data models. I see we don't have one for diseases.
Your sound was blurry. So can you repeat after data models what you said after data models?
Let me just type it. Try again. You've mentioned data models, but I don't see that we have one for diseases.
Oh, I think we do have one, but it's probably not listed there. It's probably listed somewhere under the GeneWiki project. So we could just go to, let's say, a random disease. Let's look at schizophrenia. Here it's labeled as an instance of a disease. It's a subclass of psychotic disorder. It's treated by psychology, maybe not so much. There are certain drugs that are used to treat schizophrenia with references. Then there have been genetic associations reported between schizophrenia and certain genes. And again, you have the references. Yeah. Then, yeah, it has a certain classification in ICD-9, ICD-10, and so on, and yeah, in OMIM and all those different databases. Headline plus. It has a mesh ID. Yeah, so that's the kind of data model that we have for diseases right now. And in terms of identifiers, new ones keep being added on a roughly weekly basis. And in terms of then actually filling our Wikidata with the data that is relevant to that particular property, the process is ongoing, and it's happening at vastly different speeds in different areas. So for things like genetic associations and the drugs used for treatment, that's part of what the GeneWiki team is looking after. Many of the other identifiers don't have let's say, such dedicated infrastructure, and so yeah, their content is, let's say, less complete usually.
Okay, so I think we have a rough understanding of what's already in Wikidata and what's not in terms of medicine. Thinking now about medical students who want to do some kind of research, are there any suggestions that you can give them, things that you think might be useful to both the students and the community? Where can they take it that would be interesting, rather than, you know, just putting manually some information that is missing?
Yeah, okay. Research, I think here is defined broadly, like it would include things like literature research, right?
It could. I mean,
or do you mean like real research?
I mean, like real research. The
Okay.
idea for the Wikimed elective course for American students that we've just started this year has two phases. The first is very similar to previous courses that we had on Wikipedia. It just has a Wikidata component, but we now added a phase 2 that allows students to use all the knowledge that they gain on how wiki projects, you know, run and work, and they edited some and experimented some, and now they want to take it into a research. And one venue is, of course, editing an article on Wikipedia to a status of, you know, featured article, and then try to publish it in a peer-reviewed journal. So that's one avenue, but we actually wanted to give the students more options, and I thought Wikidata, something around Wikidata could be interesting, but we need to be more specific about what they can actually do.
Okay.
So,
yeah, so first, it's probably very useful for them to just explore what is in Wikidata. I only gave very cursory introductions. So one more thing I would like to mention in this regard is, for instance, the collection of queries that the GeneWiki team has compiled here. So for instance, let's just take a few random ones here. Find drugs that treat the disease and show a link for each supporting reference. There we go. So here we have the disease multiple sclerosis with some description. Then the drug is baclofen, and there is a link here which should basically say that baclofen can be used to treat MS. Well, I don't see, well, product component of, I don't see that right now. Oh, here. Multiple sclerosis. It may treat multiple sclerosis. So that's some sort of query that you could run for any combination of drugs or diseases that you're interested in. And then if you have identified things where it's incomplete, then or outdated or whatever, you can then insert that into discussion of community if you can't fix it right away. So just exploring the content that is in there is very useful. And there the collection of sample queries like this one is very useful, as is Scholia, and as there are some other tools. So that's the first thing. And by doing this, people will naturally get ideas about what kind of research they might be doing. In some cases, this research might already have been done by somebody else. So that's why it's important to communicate. And there, for instance, there is the, again, the talk page of Wiki Project Medicine, but also they can ask on the project chat. So that's just to keep in mind. Now, to the concrete ideas. So I think data models are still something that is really needed. So One thing they could be doing, which is probably useful as an introduction for themselves to familiarize themselves with the concept of data models on Wikidata, is to look at the existing ones for diseases, genes, drugs, scientific articles. I don't have a link for that right now, but I will add that link later on. They could also work on actually creating data models for which we don't have data models yet. I mentioned three obvious ones, so clinical trials, vaccines, and hospitals. And I guess each of these would probably be a project of their own, but there may be ways of combining some of them. Yeah, developing such a data model needs insight both from the medical side and also from the data side, and some knowledge of how Wikidata handles such things is also useful. So, for instance, there's the pathogen transmission ontology, which we have tried to import into Wikidata, but there is, let's see whether I can find that right now. On Firefox, it would all be at my hand because I have bookmarks for that. Let's see.
So you can't open Firefox?
Well, I have a small and old laptop. It can't handle. Hangout is quite demanding in terms of resources. And so running Firefox in parallel to that is not recommended, especially since I just closed it. I had tabs open because I switched to Chrome here when you called me. So there is, so we're mapping here. You see the airborne transmission is an item in Wikidata, and it is being mapped to the pathogen transmission ontology entry. And what you also see is there is, well, transmission process. Some of it vector-borne. Let's see whether I can open this. In theory, I should be able to zoom in. Yeah, so the different vectors. So what this ontology does, it first models the transmission process in various ways, but it also kind of models the phylogenetic tree. So it has arthropods and then makes a distinction between insects and arachnids. And but this information is already in Wikidata, so we don't need to remodel the phylogenetic tree by importing the entire ontology. But still, we want to model the transmission process. And if you look closer at that, so they have a distinction between direct and indirect transmission. But for instance, contact is not very well specified. Contact could be sexual contact, could be just skin contact. So for things like the Zika virus, this ontology is actually not detailed enough. And so you can't easily take such external ontologies to incorporate them into Wikidata because of such problems. And that's why it is important to have someone who understands both sides and the Wiki world a little bit in order to come up with a way how to represent the things like the pathogen transmission in Wikidata. Yeah, let me add that here as well. Pathogen transmission is something where we have made some progress. So it would be a good one to actually get someone to help us finish this. So apart from data models, what else could we do? We could work on the people who are doing the work, like physicians or medical researchers. So here is a list of lists that are Wikidata generated about women scientists, not specifically filtered for medicine. So you see here some linguists, but you could filter that for medicine. And what else? We could, for instance, one research topic could be how to incorporate Wikidata into medical curricula. So as it happens, last week I was attending a barcamp session. The notes here are in German, but we can work on getting that out into some more useful language. And the question then is, well, which aspects of the medical curriculum would actually benefit from some integration with Wikidata? And some of these discussions have been had around incorporating a Wikipedia component into medical curricula. But for Wikidata, this is just starting. And so having someone to look at this in more detail would be very useful, and I would be happy to help with that. Then a large one would be to just curate the Wikidata literature on a given topic, as I've just demoed for those three topics, and I would be happy to help set this up. Then another way of diving into Wikidata would be actually to propose queries. Like, what are the kinds of questions you might actually have? And then if we translate them into Sparkle queries that Wikidata can understand, then this can help us first getting an idea on what is already in Wikidata, second, what is missing, and third, it can actually guide us in terms of data modeling or, let's say, discussing potential imports from external sources. So just, for instance, going through certain headlines in the medical literature or in, let's say, commentary papers or even in the broader medical journalism field, and then trying to translate some of those questions into Wikidata queries could be a very rich and potentially very useful exercise. And the example queries that I gave for the protein box bot, they give you an idea on how to actually do that. Then I could imagine actually adapting such queries also to disaster, like specific contexts. So for instance, here you have some sample queries around earthquakes. So when an earthquake strikes, it is often very important to find out, well, how many people are actually living in that area? And in theory, we can prepare that query and then run it automatically when an earthquake of a certain magnitude strikes. And that would give us that information right away. And if we prepare this a little bit, we could even run this query over all previous earthquakes and then see whether there are any areas for which we don't have complete population information, or where the query doesn't yield any useful results, for instance, because population information doesn't have a date information. And then the population information that we have from the 1800s is added up with the information we have from the 1900s and so on. All these kind of side effects of the queries, they can be worked on so that when disaster strikes, we're actually ready to address that information. Or you could do variants of that, like give me all the hospitals in a given geoshape, or things like that. Yeah, hospitals within a geoshape, here's an example. Things like that. So think in terms of context like a disaster, and then what kind of queries would be useful. And then once we have such queries, we can try to translate them into Sparkle. And then once we have the Sparkle, we can really try to fill Wikidata with useful information on that. Another thing to do would be to illustrate Wikidata items. So we have the items about the diseases, we have the items about the physicians, we have items about pathogens and all those different things, methodologies, diagnostic techniques, and so on. And Wikidata has properties for image, for video, and audio files, and things like that. They could be used much more systematically. And those images often already exist on Commons. So if you go to the category medicine on Commons, that has loads and loads of subcategories. And yeah, those.
But how do you see a research project?
Yeah, it depends a bit on how you define research here. So there is research in terms of how you actually link the individual file to the concept on Wikidata if you want to do it at scale. If you want to do it for an individual one, yes, you can probably do it, but it will take time. But if you want to do it at scale, like, for instance, want to make sure that all the files that are relevant to, let's say, schizophrenia are actually tagged in a suitable way, then you will have to do some research into how to model things, maybe a bit of text mining, things like that. Which I understand is not necessarily what medical students want to do, but they don't have to do this entirely on their own. They can work with the community. And there is the project of structured commons going on, where they actually try to do some of that, and they have the technical expertise and they need the content expertise. So they need feedback from people who actually understand medicine as to whether certain things they're doing in terms of tagging the files on commons with certain structured information actually makes sense in the context of that particular field. And then we have tools like file candidates. So for instance, let me just briefly demo that. Again, I'm not logged in. Here, what it does is it presents you with a set of files that it finds on Commons or on Flickr, and a set of Wikidata items. So here it's for this species of mollusk. And then it asks you to basically confirm whether any of those images are actually of that thing. And then you can specify how the image could be added to Wikidata, because there are images for the item itself, there are images for range maps and things like that. And maybe we need a similar set of images actually for certain medical topics as well. And yeah, so improving those tools such that they can be used for medicine rather than just taxonomy, or so, would also be an interesting project, I think. Mm-hmm. Then next one is info boxes. So, or basically making use of the Wikidata information in other Wikimedia projects. So if you go to articles like this telescope here, you see all those little pencils here, which basically say you can edit this on Wikidata. And if you click on that, you will be led to the Wikidata item about that particular telescope, and to the specific statement that this is part of the La Silla Observatory. And so this entire info box is generated based on the data that is in Wikidata. You can see that, yeah, so what they do here is they just call infobox telescope. And then this template will figure out automatically that we're actually talking about this telescope here, and then it will pull the relevant information from the Wikidata item. We don't have this, well, at least deployed on Wikipedias for medical content. There are some prototypes of similar templates floating around in different language versions of Wikipedia, but they're not widely used for sometimes technical reasons, sometimes social reasons. And so diving into those and trying to resolve those issues would be interesting. And the same could be done on Commons. Like you could support the idea that I mentioned before of linking the media files with Wikidata by first exposing on Commons the information that is there about the topic in question. So there are some category-specific templates already on Commons that are entirely Wikidata populated. And so this could help act as a bridge between Wikidata and the other Wikimedia projects. And then a more generic one is, for instance, how Wikimedia workflows could be integrated with disaster management workflows. So here, I've just put in a link to a series of events that we're in the process of organizing. So the simplest one is probably this. This is a dummy workshop of which a prototype is going to take place in about a month from now, where we try to bring together people who are working in disaster, let's say, management, both in terms of prevention and like emergency response, and also in terms of the aftermath. And this is people who are responding on the ground, it's people who are working on legal aspects, it's people who are working on infrastructure aspects, it's people who are doing modeling, all these kind of things, and they exist in many different organizations like the Red Cross and the World Health Organization and Médecins Sans Frontières and so on. And the Wikimedia community also does all of this in its own way. So there's lots of information, like different kinds of disasters. There's lots of information on preventive measures. There's lots of information on response measures, on all the information, on all the organizations involved. But the community, the Wiki community, and let's say the other communities, they are not very well connected. And so some systematic thought into how those connections could be optimized would seem like a useful research project as well. So that's it for the moment. I think if we have some more time and maybe some more discussion with your students, we can probably come up with more research projects. So if, for instance, they would say what their specific interests are, we can almost certainly find something that has a Wikidata component to it.
So a way to go forward would be to basically share this with the students. And then if someone is interested, I'll simply connect you, if that's okay.
Yes.
Perfect.
But it shouldn't be bottlenecked by me. So I would encourage them to actually post whatever idea they have on the talk page of Wiki Project Medicine, so that others can see it as well. And for some areas of what I've discussed today, I might well not be the best person to talk to.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe just use the talk page there. They can ping me. That certainly helps getting my attention. But yeah, this shouldn't be just at me. It's just trying to incorporate their activities into what the community is already doing.
Okay, perfect. So thanks so much for helping out. I'll certainly share this, and we can actually share it wider even if you want. I think you gave a really nice overview for anyone interested in the topic, so it might be useful for others.
Yeah, fine with me.
Perfect. So again, thank you, and I'll see you on Wiki.
Cheers.
Cheers.